After 5 years of absolute radio silence, I finally brought my husband back to my parents' estate for Sunday dinner. I thought time might have softened their hearts, or at least taught them basic manners. I was wrong. The moment we stepped into their grand dining room, my mother scoffed, and my father handed my husband a waiter's apron, telling him to make himself useful since he was used to serving people. They spent 2 hours insulting his job, mocking his background, and trying to humiliate him in front of their wealthy friends. They thought they were putting a nobody in his place. They had no idea that my husband hadn't just come to eat dinner. He had bought the controlling shares in my father's struggling firm 3 days prior. And the moment he took off that apron, my father's entire world crumbled. My name is Clara, and at 31 years old, I thought I'd seen every face of cruelty my family had to offer. 5 years ago, I packed 2 suitcases, walked out of my parents' gated estate, and swore I'd never look back. My offense? I had dared to marry Julian, a self-employed mechanic with grease under his fingernails and no family crest to speak of. To my parents, who measured a person's soul strictly by their bank balance, I had committed the ultimate betrayal. For half a decade, there was absolute silence. No phone calls, no birthday texts, nothing. But then my mother reached out, claiming time had softened her heart and that she wanted us together for her 60th birthday dinner. Julian was hesitant, but I naively hoped 5 years was enough time for my parents to grow up. If you've ever given toxic family a second chance only to regret it instantly, let me know in the comments below, because what happened next proved my parents hadn't changed at all. The gravel crunched beneath our tires as we pulled into the long, winding driveway of my parents' mansion. The massive stone pillars and manicured lawns looked exactly as I remembered, immaculate, cold, and entirely devoid of warmth. I took a deep breath, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel, but Julian gently placed his hand over mine. His calm, steady presence had always been my anchor. When we stepped onto the porch, my father opened the heavy mahogany door. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a hug. His sharp, judgmental eyes swept past me and landed instantly on Julian. When Julian extended his hand in a polite greeting, my father just looked at it, left him hanging, and turned around to walk inside. "Park the car further down the driveway next time," my father muttered over his shoulder, his voice dripping with condescension. "That beat-up sedan is an eyesore next to the Jaguars." It wasn't even a beat-up car, it was a modest, reliable vehicle. But to my father, anything without a six-figure price tag was trash. I felt my face flush with anger, but Julian just gave me a subtle, knowing smirk. We hadn't even crossed the foyer, and the trap was already set. As we walked into the grand living room, I realized this wasn't just a quiet family dinner. My parents had invited several of their high society friends, clearly eager to show off their wealth, while quietly putting us in our place. Whispers rippled through the room as my mother glided over in a silk dress that cost more than a small country's gross domestic product. She offered me a cold, superficial cheek to kiss, then turned her gaze toward Julian with a smirk that made my stomach turn. "Oh, Julian," she said, her voice intentionally loud enough to draw the attention of the entire room. "Our catering staff had a last-minute emergency, and we are terribly short-handed tonight. Since you're so used to doing manual labor and serving others, you wouldn't mind helping out, would you?" Before I could speak, she pulled a black waiter's apron from a side table and handed it to him. I felt a surge of pure rage. "Mother, absolutely not," I snapped, stepping between them. "We are guests here." "It's fine, Clara," Julian said quietly. His voice was smooth, devoid of any anger or panic. He took the apron from her hands and tied it neatly around his waist. He looked at my mother with absolute composure and smiled. "I'm happy to make myself useful." For the next hour, Julian carried trays of champagne and served appetizers to people who barely looked him in the eye. My heart burned with humiliation, but Julian moved with an uncanny grace, taking every sneer in stride. When dinner was finally served, my father tapped his crystal glass to command the room. "A toast," he announced loudly, "to perseverance. As many of you know, my firm faced a rocky quarter, but this week, Vanguard Capital approved a massive buyout deal. My company is saved, and our legacy continues. The room erupted in applause. My father beamed, then slowly turned his gaze toward Julian, who was silently taking off the apron at the edge of the room. It's a shame, Julian, my father boomed, ensuring everyone listened. If you had an ounce of ambition or business sense, maybe Clara wouldn't be living in a cramped apartment. But I suppose some men are just born to serve, while others are born to lead. My mother giggled into her napkin, and a few guests chuckled along. I gripped my dinner knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. But Julian simply folded his apron, set it on the table, and took a seat right beside me. Julian leaned back in his chair, unbuttoning his jacket with cool deliberation. The smug smirks around the table began to fade under his unbothered stance. Speaking of Vanguard Capital, Richard, Julian said, his voice easily cutting through the quiet dining room. Did their board mention why they restructured the acquisition clause at 4 p.m. on Thursday? My father's smile faltered. That's confidential corporate business. Not something a grease monkey would comprehend. Actually, it was a 12% equity swap with a strict debt liquidation mandate, Julian replied smoothly, taking a sip of water. I know because I signed off on the terms myself. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. My father let out a harsh, nervous laugh. What ridiculous fantasy are you talking about? 5 years ago, I didn't just fix cars, Richard, Julian said softly. I built a logistics fleet, sold it to a venture firm, and bought controlling interest in Vanguard Capital 6 months ago. As of 3 days ago, I am your majority stakeholder. My father's glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. The color completely drained from his face as he stared at the man he had spent the last 2 hours trying to humiliate. Julian calmly pulled his phone from his inner jacket pocket and slid it across the mahogany table. On the screen was the digital signature page of the buyout agreement, displaying Julian's name clearly listed as the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Partner of Vanguard Capital. My father's hands trembled violently as he picked up the device. My mother gasped, her face turning pale as she looked around the room at her wealthy friends, who were now staring at my father in utter shock. The high society guests quickly realized that the man my parents had forced to wear a waiter's apron was the very man who held my father's entire financial life in his hands. Julian, please, my father stammered, his arrogant posture completely collapsing. There must be a misunderstanding. We were just joking around earlier. Family banter. Family? Julian asked, his voice cold as ice. Family doesn't hand a man an apron to humiliate him in public. As your majority creditor, my first official order tomorrow morning will be a full forensic audit into your company's mismanaged funds. You have 30 days to settle your personal debts to Vanguard, or we foreclose. My father sank back into his chair, looking broken and visibly aged. My mother tried to speak, but no sound came out as her wealthy friends began making hasty excuses to leave the ruined party. Julian stood up, smoothed his jacket, and held out his hand for me. I took it, standing tall beside the man who had proven his strength not with loud insults, but with quiet, absolute power. As we walked toward the heavy front doors, I didn't look back at the mansion, the manicured lawns, or the parents who had traded their own daughter for pride. They had dug their own grave, and all we did was let them fall into it. Poetic justice never tasted so sweet. If you were in my shoes, would you have given them 30 days? Or destroyed their company on the spot? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.